Andrew, thank you very much. And I just thought I'd just, in the context of that last conversation, just say that I spent this morning at my quarterly meeting with the heads of profession of statistics right across government, all of whom are unbelievably brilliant, all of them are unbelievably committed to precise as can be, statistics and evidence for policy. And I think they're all having an enormous, I would have to say, influence. I could talk about anything. I thought I wouldn't talk about the kind of estimation of hierarchical chain graphs that go on day in, day out across government these days, because frankly, as you will all know, you might have a complex hierarchical chain graph, but if the data to drive it aren't much use, then frankly, your answers aren't going to be terribly useful. So I thought what I'd do is run through some numbers, because everybody will be tired, because it's whatever time it is, it's 10 to 4. I'll run through some numbers, show you some numbers, but make a point. And the point is that data are changing, data are flowing. In government, we use data in different ways all the time. We link data. Critically, most of the things that are going on across government do, in the big ways, involve linking data. And we use multiple data sets from multiple types to analyze multiple problems. And I'll just run through a few of them, but let me just start with some pretty easy stuff. This is very simple. Just a few population pyramids, which are actual, just simple data, although the last one is projected using some pretty good projection techniques that we use now. And what they show, frankly, is as a nation, we're getting older. And secondly, there will be more of us. Secondly, if I look at these graphs, which again are pretty straightforward, on the left-hand side, by local authority across England and Wales, the proportion of the population aged 65 and over. On the right-hand side, the proportion of the population aged 85 and over. Dark means bigger. If you look at the right-hand side, that's the population aged 85 and over, you'll see the dark numbers tend to be along the south coast, a little bit in Herefordshire. That's because a long time ago, when I was a boy, people retired to the south coast. Then a few years later, they stopped retiring to the south coast. Why? Because it was full of old people. And very simply, let's remember that those who are over 65 those who are over 85 are still over 65. What we've seen over time is a change in internal migration. So you can now see in the population on the left-hand side, Mid Wales is one of the latest booms, as is the North Lakes is a big boom area, North Wales. And Pembrokeshire. The bottom line is that's where people age 65 are now retiring to. So if we're trying to plan health services and things like that, it's not a brain that these people will get old. And they won't move, we know, terribly much. But of course, I have to say this, because it's 100 years since McKendrick published one of the most wonderful papers ever. I'm sure you've all read it. And it talks about healthy migrants. But these people, because they've migrated, will be healthy. These people will be less healthy. And if we look at the number of years a 65-year-old can expect to live without a limiting illness, and the bottom line is we now use modelling and statistical modelling to be able to estimate those people with a limiting long-term illness. And the bottom line is that the dark areas there are those areas where only a high proportion of the population will have only a tiny number of years past 65 without a limiting long-term illness. So if you think you can just put your health policy in those areas where everybody's going to get old, well, you need to do that, but you also need to worry about these areas. I would have to say that if you look at these areas, if you look at that line that goes across Liverpool towards Humberside and then comes down a bit, if I showed you infant mortality in the 19th century, it would look almost the same. We have areas of our country where, frankly, illness remains. So if you're planning health, there are issues there, particularly if you look at where that's coming from. I'm going to come back. Remember the bottom line there? One of the reasons where illness is getting bigger, and again, we use multiple data sets to be able to look at this, is in chronic pain. I'm going to return to that. But secondly, the second one there is diabetes. Let me show you that. This is an estimate by local authority. And we, again, massive surveys, massive estimation, massive measurement. On the left-hand side is the prevalence of obesity in 4 to 5-year-olds. In the right-hand side is the prevalence of obesity in 10 to 11-year-olds. The bluer, the higher. Now, I'm not a medic and I'm not an expert, but I suggest that that is going to drive some of that diabetes unless we do something about it, and it's going to be there for a long time. Again, policy in government driven all the time by data that we're really working on, and childbearing. Now, if you look at the left-hand side, that's childbearing rates, again calculated for 20 recently. Childbearing rates for each local authority, green, right? So look for the green. Look for that green is where childbearing is above what we call replacement level. If you imagine two people, it needs two people to have one person, then, you know, if everybody has two children, then you're replacing. So I don't know what's going on in Milton Keynes, but apart from that, we're pretty much below childbearing. If you want the good news, is Korea is in serious problem. We're doing quite well compared with Korea and Japan, but still we're well below what we would call replacement level. So, you know, the question is, should we have pronatalist policies? Well, pronatalist policies, if you ask the French aren't very good at pronatalist policies. I have to say they've tried many, but there is a real question about how do we make it easy for couples to have the children they want to have when they want to have them. And that's a real question, I think. Because I did say when I showed the population earlier, we're getting bigger. We're not making babies. We are growing a bit older, but that doesn't drive that big increase in population. What is driving the increase in population has been for some time is migration. This graph shows you net migration. That's in migration over minus out migration since 2012 going forward. What you see is I would only look at the number that goes up a lot at the end. That's very recent, and that is post-pandemic, and it is migration from outside of the EU, and that is more than migration of EU citizens, which is actually going down. I would say there is a point here, again, which is just an arithmetic point, and that net migration in from outside the EU, part of that is to fill labour shortages, and I will come to that. But a big part of it is student immigration, because one of the craziest United Nations definitions ever, from about 100 years ago, is that a migrant is someone who comes for more than a year. If you come to do a master's course, you stay for a year and a week, you are classified as an immigrant, okay? So, a lot of immigrants. So, look, I apologise, I'm not trying to talk down to you, but if you think about it, during the pandemic, almost no international students came in. Obvious. So there aren't any to go out. And what we do know, because when we put these data together, this isn't sort of made up data. These are data using advanced passenger information, visas, Home Office border data, loads and loads of different sources brought together. So there aren't any students to go out. So your net in-migration is very high. So one thing, look, I don't do predictions. No, I don't, honestly. But just in case, net migration is going to go down in the next 3 to 4 years, promise, okay? Because those students, we know from all our sources, 85 to 90% of international students go home within 5 years. Yeah, so they will go home. Unless, and that's why I don't do predictions, unless there's a massive change that I'm not predicting. But that's been going on for years and years and years. Right, so let me say a few words about the economy. Here's GDP. Putting that together, we will publish the next monthly GDP tomorrow. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but listen to the Today Show on Radio 4 at 7 o'clock in the morning. They'll have it on. The bottom line is, though, those numbers, that might look like a pretty simple graph. How many data sets go into making each of those numbers? 90. Right, round figures, sometimes 87, depending on which month it is. So the bottom line is, massive data sets linked together, brought together in different ways, enable us to be able to get that simple number, which is GDP. Now, you say, what is GDP? It's a measure of the total output of the country, and sometimes you can make some kind of understanding. So, why did it go down in November? Look out of the window. It rained a lot. If it rains a massive amount, construction stops, and then your outputs go down. So you need to understand what's going on at all time, just as you do when you look at inflation. I am so excited. No, really, honestly, I am. I'm so excited because when I was young, my kind of ambition was not to make money. It was to have enough, it was to have enough money to buy an album every week. And then in 1992, the ONS, or it wasn't called the ONS then, took vinyl records out of inflation characteristic. Guess what came back this week? Vinyl records, yo. I'm so excited. No, it's true. But when we put that together, when we put inflation together, that's a mass of surveys, a living costs and food survey. We've got data on not only groceries, but we're moving those data on groceries to, we have now coming in, it's not quite on, it will be in a couple of months, scanner data, daily scanner data from every supermarket. Think how big that is and how we're moving that. That will really enable us properly to know what the consumer is doing. And secondly, we're just bringing on, just now, used car prices using electronic data, rents using electronic data. In other words, what our data are changing the whole time. And I think that's really super important. And indeed, we use Visa card data all the time. So we get, on a daily basis, 98% of debit and credit card transactions come in. That helps us to understand what the consumer is doing. During the credit card crisis, we had, for example, direct debits. We knew the number of direct debits that were being cancelled on a daily basis, together with whether or not they were cancelled because there were no funds to pay them or whether it was a choice, so that we're able to understand and to inform Treasury and Bank of England policy using those data. And this just shows how we can understand local spend and how spend is going up in some of those areas in Wales quite a lot. But at the same time, one of the government's major pushes, and last week the Chancellor in his spring statement talked about it a lot, was productivity. Productivity in our country is and has been. I mean, I used to talk about productivity in the early 2000s when I was in research councils, and put pretty simply, as a nation, output has not been growing. On the left-hand side, you can see output per hour worked and average weekly earnings. At the end of the day, average weekly earnings have been going up about the same amount in real terms. But compared with other countries on the right-hand side, we lag behind, both in terms of labour composition. We don't have, if you like, the skill bases of places, of some places. We don't have the amount of capital investment, particularly in R&D, and we don't have the amount of, if you like, productivity that is going on. So in other words, we lag behind just about all countries except Canada, Japan and Italy in terms of productivity. And that, in terms of the public sector, and one statistic that we put out lately is that each public sector worker spends on average about 70 minutes a day more than the average, I mean, I apologise for a gazillion averages, the average private sector worker on administration. So that's what drives some of the chancellors, I think entirely right, drives to say, can we use different methods to improve the productivity and thence to improve public services? And that's, that just shows, we look at here, we've been looking at R&D. We have a large survey of research and development, which has totally been transformed. The data come in direct from 40,000 companies around the country, and they get analysed more or less in real time. And that shows us over time that, put pretty simply, UK business investment hasn't grown. And if you look at the previous graph, compared with other countries where business investment is much higher, ours simply hasn't grown effectively since, it went up a bit in the first half of the last decade and it's flattened since. So we do have a real issue there. But then also, you may recall that I talked a little bit about chronic pain earlier. We've looked very, very carefully. We've got a large number of surveys which link together, and then we link some of those surveys with GP data to understand what people have, why they're not working and where there are illnesses. If we do that kind of thing, what we see is That left-hand side, above 0, is a change in economic activity for different ages, right? So that is people who are becoming inactive. So the dark blue is what's happened, the light blue is what we're expecting. Now, if you do the right on the right-hand side there, that's people aged 60 to 64. It's not rocket science to say that people aged 60 to 64 are likely to retire. So therefore you see that if you like, those people stopping work about the same as we might expect it. The big number is the next two. That's the 50 to 54 and the 55 to 59. 500,000 50 to 60-year-olds since the pandemic have left the labour force in order to become inactive. Many of them driven by musculoskeletal reasons, some for a whole range of other reasons. And the Chancellor has, I think, put some really interesting and innovative policies over the last year to try and encourage those people back to the labour force. Because if I go back, I think I'm allowed to go back to that slide there. My colleagues hate it when I say what I'm about to say. So can you just take the numbers here with just a hint of there's quite a few standard deviations around it. But 100,000 people full-time in the labour force equals about 0.1 on GDP. Add 500,000 there, add 0.5, and you've got the answer to why that's a bit lower. Again, it's not rocket science, but effectively, we have a situation on the left-hand side there where increased inactivity, particularly amongst those 50 to 59, is a real issue. The other area that we are a bit worried about, it's a much smaller number, but let's look just down the left, 18 to 24. We have seen an increase in inactivity that we were not expecting amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. That's not driven by musculoskeletal. That's largely driven by mental ill health, and it is more towards women than men. Numbers are relatively small, okay, but if you think, I mean, Andrew is here. I mean, I've talked about this with him before. The scarring from losing some early employment is absolutely critical, and we need to worry about that. And then the final point I would note is the right-hand side, which are growth rates in employment counts. Now, again, this is weekly data from HMRC on the number of people on payrolls. Now, to his great credit, Prime Minister Johnson once stood up in Prime Minister's Question and said, there are more people in the labour force than ever before. And we wrote him a kind of outraged of the ONS letter, saying, actually, these are weekly data on the number of people on payrolls, so they don't include the self-employed, so it's not the labour force. To his great credit, the next week, he said, there are more people on payrolls than ever before. It's the effect of, you can get your statistics right, but just to make that point again, the employment growth, the big black line is the percentage increase in non-EU employment. That is largely into health and social care and into other areas. And if we then look, we have all the online job sites. We bring them together on it's about a weekly basis, and then we're able to look at labour demand. And if I look at healthcare, this is just for healthcare. I can do this for anything, and I can speak for days on some of this. I get quite excited about this, but if you just look there, the blue are the places where there are massive demand for healthcare. So, okay, we're bringing people in, but notice that some of those blue areas are some of the places I spoke about earlier where there are ageing populations, where I talked about earlier, where in some cases, particularly those around Scotland, where there are people with limiting long-term illness. So the bottom line is, yes, we are bringing people in to work in healthcare, but yes, we still have demand. And I am conscious that we've now only got a couple of minutes. We've got 1 minute. I've got a sign up here saying there's no time for Q&A. How outrageous is that? We're going to have one question because the next thing is up, but there you go. This should now say refreshments and networking. Thank you very much. The good news is that if you say there's only time for one question, no one ever asks a question.
I don't know that that's going to happen soon. The one question that stands between us, refreshments and networking. There it is. I knew it'd happen. Say it quickly. We'll give you a quick answer. There will be a microphone coming behind you.
Which bit of data don't you have, which you would most like to have?
Ooh.
Now, well, no, it's not controversial. There's a fabulous report that Denise Leavesley, who many of you will know, has published today, and in it she talks about data sharing. And one of the things that still is a challenge is data sharing. And the one piece I would really like is some benefits. There are some benefits data that I don't have at the moment from DWP that we're just working on, if you like, the security of and everything there. That when we get those, that will enable us absolutely properly to understand more about some of those inactivity questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enlightening as always. I love a good set of charts. Who here was enjoying that? Kind of reading the colours, seeing all of it, and then you're explaining just to confirm that we all knew what we're looking at, which is the power of communication, right? It's worth that investment for understanding. Okay, we're going to head up for refreshments and networking. We'll be back at, I'm going to say, 25 to. Yeah, there we go. We've all got watches, we've all got clocks. We know how it works. See you at 25 to.